and the playing of the national anthem.
Halt! Present! Arm!
Please be seated. Thank you, MacDill Honor Guard and Staff Sergeant Malone. We would like to take this opportunity to introduce our honored guests and distinguished visitors for today's event. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General David Goldfein. The Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Kaleth O. Wright. The Commander, 6th Air Mobility Wing, Colonel Steve Snelson. The Command Chief, 6th Air Mobility Wing, Chief Master Sergeant Sarah Sparks. And finally, we would like to thank our Gold Star families, commanders, chiefs, senior enlisted leaders, mission partners, civic leaders, family and friends for being with us today.
Of June 6th, this was the battleground. Fierce fighting around Caen. Vast squadrons of bombers and transports led the way. More than 11,000 planes spearheading the attack. Paratroopers landed in Normandy behind the coastal defenses. Landings made with timing and precision, perfected only through scores of rehearsals like this.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen, of the Allied Expeditionary Force. You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
Today, just as in these scenes, the armies of the United Nations have made their first landings on the soil of Western Europe. Another of the great decisive battles of world history has been joined. This is the day for which free people long have waited. This is D-Day.
The elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savages. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Marston has quite a few very historic uniforms. We put on a uniform pageant during our ball. Amongst them is the 1944 Marine Infantry uniform that would be worn, which I'm currently wearing right now. It consists of a blouse, trousers, there's boot stirrups, boots, the K-bar, knife, pouches for ammunition, and a canteen.
So getting the Tampa Bay community involved was really important to us, and we wanted to make sure that somehow we brought them into the fold as we kind of put this thing together. And so we reached out through our community outreach partnerships and talked to many local partners and found that there were actually several veterans of World War II and many from D-Day itself who were not only able to come here but interested in joining and being a part of the ceremony, as well as many of their family members who have chosen to come and be with them here today.
It's a moment for us to pause and celebrate, not just with airmen, but with all the service members on MacDill Air Force Base. That makes us so special within the Department of Defense of how many joint service members we have here. It's also a chance for us to pause and celebrate with our community. Really.
In the pre-dawn hours, airmen meticulously completed their pre-flight checks. Sailors anxiously walked the decks of their ships. Soldiers checked, rechecked, and triple-checked the location of every grenade and magazine on their heavy packs. In those pre-dawn hours, no matter their task, all of these men knew, despite months of training and preparation, everything could go wrong. It was the most audacious gamble of the war, with incalculable odds stacked against them, not knowing what horrors awaited them on the other side of the English Channel. To quote a former president, "If prayer were made of sound, the skies over England that night would have been deafening." Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. I'm Colonel Steve Snelson, the commander of the 6th Air Mobility Wing, and welcome to our commemoration of the 75th anniversary of D-Day. As we walked through the doors of the theater this morning and creatively stepped back in time, there are a multitude of emotions and thoughts running through each of us. Personally, I don't know if we should be somber, if we should be excited or joyous or reflective. But quite honestly, I think it's okay if we're all of those things, because today we don't just commemorate our victory, as proud as we still are. We don't just honor the incredible sacrifice, as grateful as the world may still be. We come here today to remember the Americans and our allies who gave so much for the survival of liberty and freedom at a moment of historic peril. For on that morning, more than 150,000 souls, 85% of which who had never seen combat before, they set off towards a tiny sliver of sand, attempting something no invader had successfully done in 3 centuries. In the most powerful display of America's commitment to human freedom, wave after wave of young men stormed the beaches, skies, and waters of Normandy, fighting to liberate people they had never met and fighting for ideals they couldn't live without. By day's end, the Allies would suffer some 10,000 casualties, including the lost potential, hopes, and dreams of 4,400 men killed in action. While I'm not sure if those men realized what rested on the success of that day, what's clear to us now in the weeks, months, and 75 years that have followed, June 6, 1944, it set the course for democracy and freedom for the entire world. The men who fought there and the scores of men and women who powered the American military fighting force back home, they were, as Roosevelt called them, the lifeblood of America and the hope of the world. That's what makes today so special and so important for us to stop and to remember those men and women of the greatest generation and to recognize some of those heroes in our midst today. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's with great honor that I ask you to please rise and with thunderous applause, welcome the World War II veterans joining us today.
First Lieutenant Bud Berry is 98 years old and was a member of the Army Air Corps 439th Troop Carrier Group. On June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Berry piloted his C-47 over the beaches of Normandy, where he transported paratroopers behind enemy lines. During the mission, his C-47 was hit with .30 caliber bullets that ripped a hole in one of his wings, and the aircraft next to him was shot down. Lieutenant Berry was awarded the Air Medal and currently lives with his wife Peggy of 70 years. Colonel William Shanks is 95 years old and was a Marine First Lieutenant pilot during World War II. He piloted his F-4 while assigned to the VMF 223rd stationed at Guadalcanal Island. Colonel Shanks flew close air support for numerous missions in the Solomon Islands and the Philippines, and is credited with destroying 2 Japanese Zeros. Colonel Shanks has over 6,000 flying hours and over 100 carrier landings. He received the Legion of Merit and Distinguished Flying Cross and retired with over 30 years of service to his country. Petty Officer Second Class Joseph Kay is 93 years old and was a combat photographer aboard the escort carrier USS Wake Island. Petty Officer Kay participated in the battles of Solomon Islands, Iwo Jima, and the Battle of Okinawa, where his ship was hit by a kamikaze fighter, where they were forced to return for repairs. After the war, Petty Officer Kay spent time in Third War countries helping to rebuild them. For his efforts, he was personally thanked by the Pope. Many of the World War II photographs today were taken by Petty Officer Kay. Sergeant Boris Stern is 93 years old and served in the Army with the 2nd Battalion, 424th Infantry Regiment, 106th Infantry Division. Sergeant Stern served in World War IV and 4 World War II campaigns, including the Battle of the Bulge, and was one of 18 survivors in his 180-person unit. He earned France's highest honor, the Knight of Legion of Honor, before finishing his 3-year tour. Sergeant Stern later earned his Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry and now resides in Tampa. He enjoys spending time with his 2 children and 3 grandchildren. First Lieutenant Bob McClintock is 100 years old and was a member of the Army Air Corps 836th Fighter Group. Lieutenant McClintock was stationed in North Africa, flying his P-40, where he volunteered to move to Naples, Italy. Once there, he trained for 4 hours on his newly modified P-51 before his first combat mission. He eventually flew 86 missions neutralizing enemy forces. Lieutenant McClintock flew his last mission 8 days before the D-Day invasion. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, 5 Air Medals, and the Presidential Unit Citation. Technical Sergeant Robert Rands is 98 years old and a member of the Army Air Corps' 98th Bomb Group. He was a gunner, radio operator, and photographer aboard his B-24. On August 1st, 1943, his B-24 was shot down during the famed Polosti raid, where he spent the next 13 months in a German prison camp in Romania. Technical Sergeant Renz was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart. Yeoman Second Class Dorothy Grokey is 94 years old and was a member of the United States Coast Guard SPARS unit from 1944 to 1946. Dorothy lied about her age to join the Coast Guard because her father fought during World War II and feared for her safety. As a Coast Guard SPAR, Dorothy was stationed in Boston as a legal assistant. The SPAs were an all-female unit whose purpose was to release sailors for sea duty. Dorothy said, "The neat thing was when I got back home, I was accepted by all the fellows because I was also in the service." Corporal Robert Pinter is 92 years old. Drafted into the Army in 1944, Corporal Pinter was a member of the 35th Infantry Regiment, 25th Division, Lima Company, as a company clerk and worked as a liaison between unit leaders and the infantry regiment. On 19 September 1945, the 35th Division took over an occupation sector in Osaka, Japan, where Corporal Pinter spent his days during World War II. Staff Sergeant Harley Reynolds is 95 years old and participated in operations in North Africa. As a combat gunner assigned to the 16th Infantry Regiment on June 6, 1944, Staff Sergeant Reynolds left the USS Chase to storm Omaha Beach. Staff Sergeant Reynolds was the first person to penetrate the German barbed wire, where he continued to push forward toward the fight. At the conclusion of the war, Staff Sergeant Reynolds had the highest number of combat points of anyone in England. Staff Sergeant Reynolds was awarded the ETO ribbon with battle stars and 6 bronze arrowheads, 3 bronze stars with gallantry in action, the Purple Heart, and the combat green ribbon, awarded to those that led in combat. Thank you, honored guests, for allowing us to celebrate you. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. At this time, the MacDill Honor Guard will perform a flag fold, and each World War II veteran will be presented a flag. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General David Goldfein.
Wow. How about that honor guard? Let's give them a round of applause. So what an incredible honor it is to be part of this ceremony, to answer those who answered our nation's call. You know, typically when we have a flag folding ceremony, we are gathered to mourn a loss, but not today. Today we celebrate, and we retell the heroic stories of the brave men and women who took a stand against oppression, emerging on the right side of victory, and allowing this great experiment called democracy to flourish. I so enjoyed meeting each of you in the reception beforehand, and especially First Lieutenant Bob McClintock, who shared with me that he is starting his second century this year. But he also shared something that I had never thought of, and after today I will never forget. You see, Bob is also an accomplished tenor singer and sings our national anthem. And he shared with me, he said, our national anthem is the only anthem where the first verse ends in a question. And it's every generation's challenge to answer that question. Sir, thank you for sharing that. Because this is an opportunity to remind ourselves, especially those of us privileged to wear our nation's uniform, of the oath we took to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that we bear true faith and allegiance to the same. And we recognize the sacrifices of our loved ones and our Gold Star families who often bear the pain and the brunt of war. And how appropriate that we do so with the leadership of today's Air Force as we gather for our Corona Conference. Yesterday, our lead logistician, Lieutenant General Warren Berry, led us through an extraordinary exercise to discuss how we might overcome logistical challenges should a war in Europe break out again. And while the tools and the character of war have changed over the years, the nature of warfare remains constant. History may not repeat, but it does rhyme now and then. And when I travel around the Air Force, I remind our airmen that those of us who serve in uniform today enjoy the trust and confidence of a grateful nation. We can't walk 5 feet in an airport without somebody coming up to us and thanking us for our service. And the only response I've found appropriate is to say, it's an honor to serve. Because the truth is, we enjoy our trust, the trust and confidence of our nation, not so much for what we do, but because of those who paved the way. Like many today gathered from our greatest generation. And it's our sacred duty to take the torch that's been entrusted and handed to us and turn it over to the next generation even stronger. And I will tell you, of all the blessings of serving as the 21st Chief of Staff, at the top is my opportunity to serve with my wingman, the finest Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force in our history, Kaleth Wright. Wingmanship defines who we are as airmen. And there was an ace in World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who summed it up perfectly. He said, the wingman is indispensable. I look after the wingman, and the wingman looks after me. It's another set of eyes protecting me. That's the defensive part. Offensively, it gives us a lot more firepower. We work together. We fight together. Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Kaleth Wright, is an inspirational and as charismatic as they come. By his own admission, he was a troubled airman early in his career, but through power of hard work and positive mentorship by strong non-commissioned officers, or NCOs, he rose to become my closest advisor at the top enlisted leader in our Air Force. Over the years, I've come to believe that every successful officer who grows to the senior ranks is raised and mentored by great NCOs. Chief Wright brings maturity beyond his years, wisdom, courage, and a refreshing sense of humor, inspiring everyone he meets. There's no finer NCO, airman, husband, father, who just makes you want to be a better person. And he was born to lead our remarkable airmen. He makes me a better chief. So how appropriate today that he is our keynote speaker, because most of the men who stormed that beach were enlisted, as were so many in the bombers and the transports overhead, the greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal. I'm honored every day to serve with him. So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 18th Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Chief Kaleth Wright.
Well, thank you, General Goldfein, for that great introduction. You know, I really do appreciate it. As many of you know, both he and I spend a lot of time on the roads, and we try to get out and meet as many airmen as possible. And occasionally, some of them will ask me, what is General Goldfein like in real life? And for all of you who don't know, he is as real as advertised. A phenomenal leader, a no-nonsense, honest wingman, a very passionate family man, and a leader who is definitely serious about the business of joint warfighting. And, you know, he'll be the first to tell you that he is a proud member of the More Takeoffs Than Landings Club. But I believe we're incredibly lucky to have him land with us as our 21st Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So thanks, boss. I'd also like to thank all of our special guests, Gold Star families, families of our veterans, and of course our honored guests that are here with us today, all of our military leaders and the men and women of Team MacDill and the 6th Air Mobility Wing. Many of our folks who are here with us today can count themselves among the group we often refer to as the greatest generation. And when we say this, we say it with reverence, admiration, and respect. These are men and women who history looks graciously upon as some of our bravest, our most selfless, most resilient Americans to ever live. They stood for liberty in the face of oppression. They answered the call as they left our shores, not knowing if they would return. And many did not. Tom Brokaw noted in his book, The Greatest Generation, and I quote, "There has never been a military operation approaching the scale and complexity of D-Day. It involved 176,000 troops, more than 12,000 airplanes, almost 10,000 ships, boats, landing craft, frigates, sloops, and other special combat vessels, all involved in a surprise attack on the heavily fortified north coast of France to secure a beachhead in the heart of enemy-held territory so that the march to Germany and victory could begin. It was daring, risky, confusing, bloody, and ultimately glorious," end quote. As it was mentioned earlier, somewhere around 10,000 of our bravest allied warriors took their last breaths 75 years ago today. They did not die, nor did the survivors suffer the wounds of war in vain. They offered themselves as the champions of liberty, not just to protect an ideal, but to defend our way of life. I believe it's true that they are part of the greatest generation of American citizens. And I submit to you the idea that the legacy they brought forth carries on to this very day. Much like the 100+ thousand new service members who join our military each year. Our forefathers entered service not knowing what the future would hold. And while we have the luxury of hindsight and can easily look back to see the greatness of their generation, if we put ourselves in their time, if we think about what the world was like when they were youngsters of the day, it's not really that hard to see why they were so remarkable and why their parents and grandparents probably had no idea that they were capable of such greatness. I'll bet you anything the Andrews sisters caused quite a stir when Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy hit the radio stations. I bet it created a little bit of controversy, as any song that you can find on Spotify today. I'll go one step further and say that the parents of this generation probably said something to this effect: "That's not real music," as they worried that the fast beat and the provocative dance moves would be the ruin of their sons and daughters. These kids, this generation. Sounds familiar. Looking at the greatest generation through this lens only bolsters my belief in their greatness. It helps me to envision them not as the battle-tested, grizzled veterans we see today, or as warriors who could stand up to any test without batting an eyelash. I see them as their parents' children, much like our live-action role players that we have here today. They were young, and much like today's millennials, many of them were hopeful, excited, and possibly even a little scared as they raised their right hand and swore their lives in the defense of their country. Seeing them as unsure and untested as they boarded the amphibious Higgins boats for Normandy helps me to understand just how courageous their actions truly were. Thinking of them attempting to steady their trembling hands as they waited for the order to take the beaches we call Gold, Juneau, Sword, Omaha, and Utah. They defined courage as not the lack of fear, but the lack of hesitation in the face of fear as they waited out the weather on the eve of this fateful day. We're fortunate. There are many firsthand accounts of battles like the D-Day invasion. We can look to our not-too-distant history to see that as World War II forces were preparing to take on our enemies, many of our troops were hopeful, they were excited, and many were afraid. But they overcame their nerves and charged ahead anyway. They did what had to be done. They did what they committed to, but they did it with the uncertainty of the outcome. And they did it with a sense of duty in their hearts. They did not do it to be considered great. When Sergeant Robert Rands, who we are honored to have here with us today, when he raised his right hand and stepped forth as a member of our Army Air Corps, he had no idea that his eventual job as a gunner, radio operator, and photographer on a B-24 would lead to a 13-month stint in a German prison camp. He also didn't know as he left home that his service to our nation would culminate in the awarding of the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart. And I guarantee you he wasn't thinking, man, I'm going down in history as the greatest generation of Americans to ever live. He was probably thinking, this is what has to be done. This is my mission. This is the challenge that God has placed in front of me. It is incredibly humbling to be in the presence of heroes like Tech Sergeant Rands. And as I look to all of our heroes here today, I believe in my heart that not a single one of them served for the glory, and the awards that they would eventually earn through their blood, sweat, and tears. They stood and faced their challenges for those standing to their left and to their right, much like today's young men and women who wear all of these uniforms. This earlier generation of Americans are truly great, but greatness was never their goal, like I said. Because they were never seeking glory, I believe they would gladly welcome selfless heroes into their ranks if given the choice. Heroes like our Master Sgt. John Chapman, who would fit right into this group if he were alive today. Much like his great predecessors, John did what had to be done. He wasn't doing it so that he could remember him, so that we could remember him as great. He did it because it was what was required. He did it to save the lives of his teammates. And while individual actions during battles and wars are among the true test of warriors, their character, they really aren't the only way that we should measure greatness. Chief Master Sergeant Amber Robbins is a warrior from today's generation. She raised her right hand just as our heroes of today did. And just like them, she left home to fight if needed. Only in her case, the enemy she would battle was cancer. Much like our D-Day veterans who soundly defeated the Axis powers, I'm proud to say that Amber's battle with breast cancer resulted in victory. She's also the kind of hero who I believe could be counted amongst the greatest if generations were not confined to a couple of decades. Heroism comes in airmen like Amber, ones who demonstrate courage, whether fighting those enemies who threaten peace or the ones that terrorize the minds and the bodies of our brothers and sisters, enemies like cancer, depression, and post-traumatic stress. So whether it's Sergeant Rands, Master Sergeant Chapman, or Chief Robbins, they're all amongst the greatest our Air Force has to offer because they've been tested. They demonstrated heroism in their perseverance and in their resilience. The stories of their battles and their triumphs should be told to guide the path for future great generations of airmen and service members. And as we look back at World War II and remember the significance of D-Day, I'd like to propose that we encourage all generations of our remaining service members, active duty, Guard, Reserve, and veterans. Let's lean on each other. Let's lean on each other for guidance. Let's lean on each other for support. The long history of our warfighter is exemplified by the story of our service members who did what was asked of them 75 years ago today. I'm honored to be with you and a few of those remaining warriors. I'm proud to know that they are among the greatest citizens who for many years have stepped forward, have fought, have lived, and died to build our country into an unending generation of greatness. Thank you.
Thank you, General Goldfein, Chief Wright, and Colonel Snelson. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's ceremony. And on behalf of the men and women of the 6th Air Mobility Wing, thank you for attending and have a pleasant day.